The first thing my HOA did was send me a bill for a tree I never cut down, and when I looked at the number on that piece of paper, I honestly thought somebody had made a mistake. They wanted me to pay over $1,000 for removing a protected tree from my property. Except there was one small problem. I never removed anything. I didn't pick up a chainsaw. I didn't call a contractor. And I didn't touch that tree with anything except my eyes the morning I found it lying across my fence after a storm. My name is Daniel Harper, and before this whole mess happened, I was just a guy who wanted a quiet life in a quiet neighborhood. I lived in a little community called Willow Creek Estates outside of Cedar Falls, Oregon, the kind of place where people waved when they drove past your house, where kids rode bikes until sunset, and where everyone pretended the biggest problem they had was someone leaving their trash cans out too long. My house sat at the end of a small cul-de-sac, tucked away from the main road, with a backyard that bordered a strip of greenbelt land filled with pine trees, bushes, and a few old oak trees that had probably been there longer than the neighborhood itself. I actually loved that part of my yard. It gave the place some character. My cedar fence was about 6 feet tall, and every summer when the sun hit the wood, you could still smell the oil stain I put on it years earlier. It was one of those small things that made a house feel like home. I wasn't looking for trouble. I wasn't the guy who argued at HOA meetings or complained about someone's mailbox color. I paid my dues, followed the rules, and kept my head down. But then came the storm. It was one of those winter nights where the wind sounds like it is trying to break into your house. Around 2 a.m., I remember waking up because I could hear branches cracking outside, garbage cans rolling down the street, and rain hitting the windows so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the glass. The next morning, I walked into my backyard with a cup of coffee in my hand, expecting to pick up a few branches and maybe fix a loose fence board. Instead, I stopped dead in my tracks. One of the large oak trees behind my fence had split right near the base and collapsed during the storm. The trunk was twisted, the branches were everywhere, and part of it had fallen across my cedar fence. It looked less like a tree and more like something that had been ripped out of the ground by a giant hand. I called the city because, honestly, I didn't know what else to do. A few days later, a crew showed up wearing bright orange vests. They inspected the tree, fired up their chainsaws, loaded the broken pieces into a chipper, and by lunchtime, they were gone. The yard was clean again. The fence was repaired. Life moved on. At least I thought it did. About 6 months later, I came home from work and found a white envelope sitting in my mailbox. I recognized the HOA logo immediately. Those envelopes never brought good news. Usually it was something small, like a reminder about lawn height or a warning about leaving a decoration out too long. But this time was different. Inside was a 3-page violation notice that made me read the first paragraph twice because I honestly couldn't believe what I was seeing. The Willow Creek HOA was accusing me of unauthorized tree removal. According to them, I had removed a protected oak tree without approval. They had charged me a replacement fee, added penalties, and demanded payment totaling $1,200. There was even a picture attached, a photo of the empty patch of grass behind my fence with a red circle around it, like they were presenting evidence in some kind of criminal investigation. I just sat there at my kitchen table staring at that picture thinking, are they serious right now? They weren't accusing me of damaging a tree. They weren't asking questions. They had already decided I was guilty. So I picked up the phone and called the HOA office. The woman who answered sounded polite at first, but the second I explained the situation, her tone changed. That tree was removed from the area connected to your lot, she said. So you are responsible. I told her, the tree fell during a storm. The city removed it. I didn't do anything. There was a pause, and then she gave me the kind of sigh people give when they think they are talking to someone who just doesn't understand the rules. Mr. Harper, regardless of how it happened, the responsibility falls on the homeowner. That sentence bothered me more than the fine itself, because it wasn't about a tree anymore. It was about someone deciding they had authority over me without even checking the facts. I hung up the phone feeling something I hadn't felt in years. That little spark that tells you somebody just crossed a line. I knew arguing with them over the phone wasn't going to work. They had their paperwork. They had their rules. So I decided I was going to find something they couldn't ignore. I drove straight to City Hall, walked into the Public Works office, placed that HOA violation letter on the counter, and said, "I need to know who actually owned that tree." And what the clerk pulled up on his computer next changed everything. The clerk behind the counter didn't say much at first. He just clicked through a few screens, adjusted his glasses, and asked me to repeat the address one more time. I remember standing there with that HOA letter folded in my hand, watching his face because I was trying to figure out whether I was about to hear something that would help me or something that would make this whole situation even worse. After a few minutes, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Well, that's interesting. Those are never words you want to hear when you're already frustrated." I asked him what he found, and he turned the monitor slightly toward me. There it was, an official city work order from the winter storm cleanup. The date matched. The address matched. The tree removal was documented by the city itself. The reason listed wasn't unauthorized removal, landscaping change, or homeowner request. It said hazard mitigation due to storm damage. A city crew had removed the tree because it was considered dangerous. I felt a little relief, but something still bothered me. The HOA wasn't just wrong about who removed the tree. They were claiming it was my tree in the first place. So I asked the clerk the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since I walked in. "Can you tell me who actually owns that section of land?" He nodded and pulled up another system, a county mapping database that showed property lines, easements, and public land boundaries. I watched as he zoomed in closer and closer until my backyard appeared on the screen. My fence line was there. My property line was there. The greenbelt behind it was there. Then he pointed at the location where the oak tree had stood. "That tree wasn't on your property," he said. "It wasn't HOA property either." I stared at the screen for a few seconds because sometimes the truth takes a moment to actually sink in. The tree they were charging me for wasn't mine. It belonged to the city. The HOA had sent me a fine for removing something they didn't own, something I didn't remove, and something the city had legally taken down because it was a safety hazard. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the whole thing was so ridiculous that my brain didn't know what else to do. I spent years thinking HOA disputes were about little things like paint colors, fences, or someone's grass being slightly too tall. I never imagined I'd be sitting in a government office proving that a tree wasn't my tree. I printed everything I could: the work order, the property map, the ownership records. I organized it all into a binder because I knew what I was dealing with. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a situation where someone had already decided the outcome before checking the facts. And the more I looked into it, the more I started wondering why they were so confident. Why did nobody at the HOA verify the ownership? Why did they assume the tree belonged to me? Then I remembered something. A few months before the fine arrived, I had attended a neighborhood meeting where the HOA president, Mark Ellison, spent nearly an hour talking about keeping the community under control. Mark was the kind of person who walked into every room like he owned it. He always wore expensive watches, spoke in a calm voice, and had this habit of looking over his glasses when someone disagreed with him, like disagreement itself was a personal inconvenience. At that meeting, he had talked about protecting property values and making sure homeowners followed every rule. At the time, I thought he was just being overly serious. Looking back, I realized he had a different idea of what leadership meant. To him, authority came first, and facts came second. When I requested a hearing with the HOA board, I brought my binder, my documents, and every piece of evidence I had collected. I wasn't there to yell. I wasn't there to make a scene. I just wanted them to admit they made a mistake. But when I walked into that meeting room, I could already tell they weren't expecting me to come prepared. Mark sat at the front of the table with two board members beside him. He glanced at my folder and smiled slightly. "I hope this isn't going to become more complicated than it needs to be," he said. I remember looking at him and thinking, That's an interesting thing to say to someone who just proved you might have fined them for something you didn't own. I placed the documents on the table and explained everything. The storm, the city crew, the work order, the property map. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then Mark leaned forward and said, "The homeowner is still responsible for anything affecting the appearance of their lot." That was the argument they were holding on to. Not ownership, not responsibility, just proximity. The tree was near my yard, so they believed they had the right to blame me. I asked him, "So if a city-owned streetlight falls during a storm next to my driveway, am I responsible for replacing that too?" He didn't answer right away. One of the board members looked down at the paperwork again. Another quietly whispered something to her. You could feel the confidence in the room starting to disappear, but Mark wasn't ready to let go. "Our landscaping rules are clear," he said. "We have to protect the community standards." And that was the moment I realized this wasn't really about a tree. It was about admitting they had made a mistake. And some people would rather defend a bad decision than accept they were wrong. The case eventually moved beyond the HOA board because I refused to let the violation stay on my record. When the hearing date arrived, I walked into that room carrying the same binder I had built piece by piece. Mark walked in differently. He wasn't as relaxed this time. He still had the confident posture, but something was missing. Maybe it was because this time he couldn't just send a letter and expect someone to pay. This time, he had to answer questions. And the first question from the judge changed the entire atmosphere in the room. "Can you explain how you determined the tree belonged to this homeowner?" The room went quiet. Mark looked at his paperwork. Then he looked back up. And for the first time since this started, he didn't have an answer. The judge leaned forward and said, "Being next to someone's property does not make it their property." I will never forget the look on his face in that moment. It wasn't anger. It wasn't embarrassment. It was the look of someone realizing the argument they built everything around had disappeared. The judge reviewed the documents, the city records, and the property maps. Every piece of evidence told the same story. The HOA had made an assumption, and that assumption cost them. The fine was dismissed. The violation had to be removed from my record, and the HOA was ordered to reimburse my legal expenses. The total came out to $1,492, and they were given a deadline to pay. But the money was never the part that mattered most to me. The real victory was knowing that a simple homeowner with a folder of documents could stand in front of an organization built on rules and remind them that rules only matter when they are applied fairly. And just when I thought the whole thing was over, something happened in the neighborhood that showed this fight had changed more than just my situation. It had changed the way everyone looked at the people making the rules. A couple of weeks after the hearing, I noticed something strange when I walked past the community board near the entrance of Willow Creek Estates. That board had always been the place where the HOA posted reminders, warnings, and announcements. Usually, it was filled with things like trash cans needing to be moved, parking rules being updated, or some new regulation that made everyone roll their eyes but quietly follow anyway. But that morning, there was a new notice that caught my attention. It wasn't a violation. It wasn't a warning. It was a policy update. The HOA was reviewing its tree management procedures and property verification process. I stood there looking at that piece of paper for a while, and I couldn't help but think about how different that sounded from 6 months earlier when they were so certain I was the problem. Back then, they didn't ask questions. They didn't investigate. They didn't check city records or property lines. They simply looked at an empty space behind my fence, decided a tree must have been mine, and sent me a bill like the decision was already final. But now, after everything that happened, they were suddenly interested in accuracy. Funny how that works. When people don't have to answer for their decisions, they move fast, but when someone asks them to prove those decisions, everything slows down. Over the next few weeks, I started hearing things from neighbors. Not gossip exactly, more like people finally admitting things they had kept to themselves. One neighbor told me she had once paid a fine because the HOA claimed her garden lights were against community rules, even though the rules had recently changed and nobody had notified residents. Another guy down the street said he had replaced his mailbox 3 times because different board members kept telling him different versions of what was allowed. They all had the same story underneath it. They trusted the HOA because the HOA sounded official, and that was something I understood. Because before my tree situation, I was the same way. If a letter came with a logo, a signature, and a paragraph full of legal-sounding words, I assumed someone had already done the homework. I assumed they knew what they were talking about. But this experience changed the way I looked at things. Authority can be useful, but authority without accountability can become dangerous. A person can sit behind a desk, create a rule, and speak with complete confidence, but confidence is not the same thing as being correct. The truth doesn't care who has the title. It doesn't care who has been on the board longer. It doesn't care who knows more people in the neighborhood. The truth just waits until someone takes the time to find it. And, honestly, that was the biggest lesson I took from all of this. I didn't win because I was louder than the HOA. I didn't win because I intimidated anyone. I didn't even win because I wanted to fight. I won because I slowed down, looked at the facts, and refused to accept something that didn't make sense. There were moments when I almost paid the fine just to make the problem disappear. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't tempted. There's a certain exhaustion that comes with fighting an organization. They have meetings. They have documents. They have procedures. They have people whose job is literally to handle disputes. Meanwhile, most homeowners are just trying to go to work, take care of their families, and enjoy their weekends. Sometimes paying the money feels easier than spending your time proving you shouldn't have to. But every time I looked at that violation notice sitting on my desk, something bothered me. It wasn't the amount. It wasn't even the tree. It was the idea that if nobody challenged them, they would keep making the same assumption with the next person. Maybe that person wouldn't have the time to visit City Hall. Maybe they wouldn't know how to check property records. Maybe they would just write the check and move on. And that didn't sit right with me. Months later, I walked into my backyard one quiet morning with my coffee and looked toward the place where the oak tree used to stand. The sunlight was coming through the branches of the trees behind the fence, and for a second, everything felt completely normal. You would never know that this little patch of grass had created such a big conflict. No angry meetings, no legal documents, no accusations. Just a quiet piece of land doing what it had always done. That's when I realized something important. The tree was never the real story. The tree was just the thing that exposed the bigger problem. The real story was about what happens when people are given power and stop remembering who that power is supposed to serve. The HOA wasn't created to make homeowners feel helpless. It was supposed to help maintain a community where people could live peacefully together. Rules are important. Standards are important. Nobody wants a neighborhood where nobody cares about anything. But rules only work when they are fair. They only work when the people enforcing them are willing to admit when they are wrong. And that was the part that surprised me the most. I never received a personal apology from Mark Ellison. I never got a phone call where someone said, "We made a mistake." The closest thing I got was that policy change posted on the community board, but in a strange way. That was enough. Because sometimes change doesn't come from someone admitting they were wrong. Sometimes it comes from making sure the same mistake doesn't happen again. Mark eventually stepped down from the HOA board. Nobody made a big announcement about it. There wasn't some dramatic farewell speech. He was simply gone. Some neighbors said the tree incident played a role. Others said there were already disagreements inside the board. I'll never know the full story, and honestly, I don't need to. The important thing was that the system changed. The questions started getting asked. The paperwork started getting checked. Homeowners started paying attention. And maybe that was the real victory. Not the money they had to reimburse me. Not the fact that the violation disappeared from my record. The real victory was knowing that one ordinary homeowner had reminded an entire neighborhood that rules are not stronger than reality. Today, I still live in the same house. I still have that cedar fence. I still watch the seasons change from my backyard. Every now and then, I look at that open space and think about how strange it is that a fallen tree caused such a big fight, but maybe that's how these things usually happen. Big lessons often come from small moments. A tree falls. A letter arrives. Someone makes an assumption. And suddenly, you find yourself standing in a fight you never asked for. But when that happens, I think the question everyone has to ask themselves is simple. Are you willing to accept something just because someone in authority says it's true? Or are you willing to look closer and find out for yourself? Because sometimes the person who seems to have the least power is the person holding the one thing that matters most, the facts. And now I want to hear what you think. If you were in my position, would you have challenged the HOA and spent the time proving your case? Or would you have paid the fine just to avoid the stress and move on? Do you think the HOA was making an honest mistake? Or do you think they crossed a line by punishing someone before knowing the truth? Share your thoughts in the comments because these situations are never just about trees, fences, or neighborhood rules. They're about trust, fairness, and how much control a community organization should really have over the people who live there. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe for more real lifestyle neighborhood conflicts, and share this with someone who believes that sometimes the smallest battles reveal the biggest truths.